Welcome to Poetry Lockdown, day 54. Um, Today is a special day to lockdown. You're going to get two poems and you're going to get a little different kind of lockdown. So I love, reciting a poem and then talking about why I love it. But it also occurs to me that this is a really cool opportunity doing these videos. Talk a little bit about volumes of poetry, how what the energy is like between poems, and how one poem can lead into the next. I know there are some poets who are actually tuning into these series, and you might know I upload them to YouTube for my students, and there are some really sharp poets that I teach. So I thought it'd be cool to do a little bit extended lockdown today, and just talk about poetry as craft, especially constructing a book. So today's poet, Lawrence Joseph. I love Lawrence Joseph's work. Unlike a lot of poets, he is someone who his day job is a lawyer. He's a professor of law at St. John's University, and that definitely informs his work. Um, the poems that I'm going to be looking at are actually two poems from his first collection of poetry. So I'm going to actually read them one after the other, just so you can kind of see and sense the flow of these two poems. And then I'm just going to reflect on what I'm moved by in those poems and how I see them working. So here we go. This is the very first poem of his first collection. The collection's called Shouting at No One, and I've got a book that actually has this and some other of his collections together. I was appointed the poet of heaven. It was my duty to describe Teresa's small roses as they bent in the wind. I tired of this and asked you to let me write about something else. You ordered, sit in the trees where the angels sleep and copy their breaths in verse. So I did. And soon I had a public following. St. Agnes with red cheeks, St. Dorothy with a moon between her fingers, and the host of heaven. You said, you've failed me. I told you, I'll write lovelier poems, but you answered, you've already had your chance. You will be pulled from a womb into a city. We turn the page. The next poem is titled Then. Joseph breathed slower, as if that would stop the pain splitting his heart. He turned the ignition key to start the motor and leave Joseph's food market to those who wanted what was left. Take the canned peaches, take the greens, the turnips, drink the damn whiskey spilled on the floor, he might have said. Though fire was eating half Detroit, Joseph could only think of how his father, with his bad legs, used to hunch over the cutting board, alone in light, particled with sawdust behind the meat counter, and he began to cry. Had you been there, you would have been thinking of the old market's wooden walls, turned to ash, or how Joseph's whole arm had been shaking as he stooped to pick up an onion, and you would have been afraid. You wouldn't have known that soon Joseph would stumble, his body paralyzed an instant from neck to groin. You would simply have shaken your head at the tenement named Barbara in flames, or the guardsman with an M16 looking in the window of Dave's Playboy barbershop. Then closed your eyes and murmured, this can't be. You wouldn't have known it would take 9 years before you'd realize the voice howling in you was born then. What a start to a book. What a start to a career, right? Um, So I think it's useful to have a little bit of historical and biographical context. So as you might have guessed, especially from that second poem, the poet Lawrence Joseph is from Detroit. And in 1967, when he would have been, I think, 18 or 19 years old, that was when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. There were riots in a number of cities across the United States, including in Detroit. And so this scene of, I think it's his father, Joseph, either his uncle or his father, but I believe it's his father. Um, this is biographically true to his life. So I think it's important to hear that. And then if you look back to the first poem, then I feel like there's this beautiful connection between the two, right? And it's a connection that really, I think, ramifies out into all of this poet's work. Um, there is a you who the poet is addressing, right? I was appointed the poet of heaven. I'm tired of this. I tired of this, describing Teresa's small roses. And and so the you there is God. God orders this poet to sit in the trees where the angels sleep and copy their breaths in verse. That doesn't work out so well for this poet, and so he's pulled from heaven into the city. Um, and to me, this is a really interesting calling. It's a poet who's been called to describe uh, violence, right? In this very first poem, and definitely that fits with Joseph's career, Lawrence Joseph's career. If you track his work, which is exceptional, it's really really wonderful poetry. Um, One of the things that I noticed though is that in both of these poems, this you is central. In this first poem, it's God, but I noticed as a kind of a connection point, the you in the second poem then is actually the poet addressing himself, right? So I think I've talked a lot about in these lockdowns, kind of those shifts or turning points in the poem. And for me, if you've got the text in front of you, I try to put it in the Facebook post, right? That moment, he's describing his father thinking of his own father, and it says in the middle of the poem, had you been there, right? I think he's addressing himself as a poet. You would have been thinking of the old market's wooden walls turned to ash, or how Joseph's whole arm had been shaken. And it goes on. And it seems to me that this moment, this memory, in which the poet was not there, is really the birth of his poetic voice. Is really strange and fascinating, right? Um, and so we get those closing lines. You wouldn't have known. He's addressing himself. It would take 9 years before you'd realize the voice howling in you was born then. It seems to me this is kind of like that moment where the poet of heaven is kicked out and is now found his real material, or one of the key parts of his material. So um, so I emailed Lawrence Joseph. I don't want to show this to him. So you know, this is kind of like doing interpretation in the moment live when you know the poet's gonna see it. It's a little intimidating. So hopefully I'm not butchering amazing poetry. Um, but I also just wanted to read a little bit of an email that Lawrence Joseph sent me about these two. He writes, or he wrote in an email earlier this week. He said, I was appointed the poet of heaven, not only as the opening poem of shouting at no one, but also of the entire body of my work. So Where Are We? That was one of his latest collections. Like Eugenio Montale, Wallace Stevens, Adrian Rich, and Louis Zukowski, among others, I see myself writing one long poem. I find that really compelling to think about that. And I, having read those collections, I definitely think that's true. There's a coherence to his work, and it's just cool to see that the coherence was there from the beginning when he wrote the first two poems of that collection. To close this out, and this is I want to close out by addressing especially any of my students who might look at this video at some point, either now or in the future. I mean, we are right now living through an unprecedented. I mean, people use that all the time. Unprecedented time. And the truth is, we don't know what's going to happen with it, but I do know that poets who are attentive are going to give us incredible gifts from this moment. And so I want to share with you as I close, rather than read those poems again. I want to share with you from a journal that Lawrence Joseph kept as he was writing some of this poetry. So he was in law school in 1975 while he was working on some of these poems in Detroit, seeing the aftermath of those riots and what was happening in his city. And he wrote this really powerful entry in his journal, and I think that's a great way to close out. So here's what he said. This is Lawrence Joseph. Our common past experience has taught us that social breakdown eventually erupts into externalized or internalized forms of horror and violence. Survival requires that we forget, which is why, for the poet, it is literally vital to try to remember at any cost what is crucial and good. A theological concept, the act of memory becomes an act of faith. If whatever is good is to be revealed and therefore exist, the poet must remain vigilantly capable of recognizing it. Lawrence Joseph, thank you for your witness in recognizing reality, the good and the bad, in your work as a poet. You inspire me, and I hope your work will inspire my students as well. Thank you all for listening to this Poetry Lockdown, May 8th. See you soon.